Anybody who's filled up their fuel tank in recent weeks will have noticed that prices are at record highs. But will they continue to climb? In this week's update, I'll be looking at what we can expect to see in the short term, before getting Argus diesel and refining expert Benedict George's view on the longer-term outlook for European fuel prices. Data from the British government suggests that fuel prices continue to rise well into the second half of March, albeit at a slightly slower rate than we saw at the very beginning of the crisis in Ukraine. Prices at the pump tend to take around 2 weeks to reflect changes in wholesale prices, and it was around the 8th of March that wholesale diesel costs peaked and started falling. That peak, incidentally, was the highest recorded by Argus since we began tracking diesel prices all the way back in 1996. But wholesale fuel prices only fell for a week before starting to trend upwards again, supported by a global rise in the cost of crude oil. And that makes any meaningful fall in retail prices very unlikely, at least in the short term. To get a more detailed, longer-term outlook, I sat down once again with our resident diesel and refining expert Benedict George to get his take on what comes next.
I think there's still a lot of waiting and seeing to be done. So the UK, for example, has said it's going to ban Russian oil imports at the end of the year. Now, when that happens, it could have a serious impact for the market, but there don't seem to be any preparations tangibly in terms of actual trade flows so far for that ban. The diesel is absolutely still coming into UK ports from Russia. The EU seems to have decided at this point not to follow the UK and the US in a full ban on Russian oil imports. And I think for a lot of people that is crisis averted, because an EU ban was the really scary thing, which would have meant a huge rearrangement of diesel trade flows around the world, where much more would have been needed from Saudi Arabia and India and so on. That doesn't appear to be happening. So the crisis is less severe maybe than it was feared.
There was a very interesting article written by Javier Blas over at Bloomberg, in which he said that while the price shock of crude might be wearing off, Europe really does have to watch out for not just diesel prices, but actual potential supply shortages. Is this something that you're worried about?
I think for that to become a real risk, we'd need to see a much more severe impact on physical trade flows than we have currently seen. So currently the spot market has dried up in the sense that not very many spot trades are happening, but we are still seeing the long-term contracts for diesel supply into Europe from Russia. These are still being fulfilled in exactly the way that they were beforehand. If they ran into trouble, or if they start to come around for renewal, and if the political climate has evolved and companies are trying to divest all relationships with Russia, I'm not sure if that's what we're expecting at this point, but if that were to happen, once they come around to renew these contracts, and therefore they don't renew these contracts with Russia, then I think we could be looking at physical pump shortages. But there's probably long enough now, before these contracts need to be renewed, that companies will be able to make contingency plans if they're expecting not to renew their contracts with Russia. So I don't think, personally, I would expect shortages at the pump anytime soon.
Some in the market have continued to trade with Russia essentially in exactly the same way as they were before, which is their right, since there aren't sanctions directly on Russian energy in most major markets. Do you think that there is a situation we could get to in Ukraine where even some of those companies thought the reputational risk now is too high?
I think, personally, the response of the media to the whole crisis may be more important in a sense than what actually happens on the ground, in that I think we can imagine that a company suddenly gets a lot of media attention for continuing to trade with Russia, and without anything tangibly changing on the ground in Ukraine, a sudden public awareness of the fact that these trading companies are trading with Russia still, you could imagine would put enough pressure on them to change what they were doing. I don't know how much it depends on the actual course of the conflict. I think it's important to note that the huge companies that have very famously so far said that they're not going to buy any more Russian oil, these tend not to be the companies that import the most Russian diesel into Europe. Russian diesel usually is supplied to Europe through long-term contracts with smaller importer companies and also bought by trading companies who then sell it on to these importers. Very few, if any, of these companies have said anything about trading with Russia. That's why they are continuing to do so, and that's why the diesel is still moving.
Okay, so the immediate heat has gone out of the diesel market. Things are looking slightly less apocalyptic than they were just a few short weeks ago. Where do you see things going from here?
I think that the mood has turned optimistic in the Northwest European market, at least. So one trader was telling me 2 weeks ago it looked almost impossible to buy any diesel from Russia. Last week he was saying he was feeling optimistic about it. He was exploring different ways that he could buy it without needing banks to lend credit to him to do that, because banks are still refusing to offer credit for the purchase of Russian oil. But there are alternative ways they can do it. It usually involves asking the Russian supplier to accept a bit of extra risk. But the Russian suppliers are probably willing to do that because they don't have too many other options for where to sell their oil. So the market is finding ways to get the diesel out. The EU doesn't seem remotely interested in banning Russian oil. I think the German government has indicated it will actively oppose any such ban. And so without any further sanctions directly on oil, and with the market doing its best to evade any kind of adjacent measures that have been put in place, I think we can expect to see diesel trade with Russia continue in very much the way that it is now. But it will depend whether the Ukraine situation kind of moves out of the news cycle, or if it intensifies and governments are under more public pressure to put more pressure on companies to stop trading with Russia, in which case maybe sanctions become more severe. Maybe the EU's hand is forced and they do intervene to sanction oil directly, and then we're straight back into crisis territory.
Thank you very much for joining me again this week. Please like and share the video, and I'll see you again next time for another edition of the Argus European Products Update.